The owls had gone first. That was always how Harry noticed it, not the trunks lined up along the corridor outside the dormitories, not the sound of footsteps clattering down staircases with unusual urgency, but the sudden quiet in the owlery. He had gone up there on the morning of the 23rd for no particular reason, just to see Hedwig, and he had found perhaps a dozen birds, where usually there were hundreds. They sat in the high rafters with the particular stillness of creatures who understood that something had shifted. Hedwig blinked at him from her usual perch, her feathers ruffled against the cold that came in through the open arches, and the sound of wind moving through empty wooden roosts was oddly hollow. He had stayed longer than he meant to. Below, in the castle proper, the morning had the particular quality of a place in the process of becoming something else. The corridors were not yet quiet. There was still noise, still the rumble of trunks being dragged. Across stone, still bursts of laughter, and the occasional shouted farewell. But underneath all of it, there was a different texture, as though the walls themselves were settling into a new arrangement. Harry had noticed it. Every year he had stayed at Hogwarts for Christmas, this particular transition. But this year it felt more pronounced. Or perhaps he was simply more aware of it. The year had a way of making him more aware of things he would rather not think about. And so he had begun noticing smaller things instead. The hollow owlery, the sound of wind in stone corridors, the way light fell through windows when the crowds thinned enough to let it reach the floor. He came back down from the owlery and stood for a moment at the top of a staircase that led toward the entrance hall, watching the flow of students below. Fourth years, he half recognized, moved in clusters, dragging luggage, calling to one another. A pair of second-year girls he didn't know were saying goodbye with the particular intensity of that age, as though the 3 weeks apart might be insurmountable. A Hufflepuff prefect was consulting a list and counting heads. The enchanted ceiling above the entrance hall reflected a sky that was uniformly grey, the kind of grey that promised snow without yet delivering it, and the torches in their brackets gave off a warm amber light that made the cold air feel almost comfortable. Ron found him there. "Ginny's just left," he said, coming to stand beside Harry on the landing. He didn't sound particularly sad about it. It was the tone of someone reporting a fact. Mum sent a howler last week, apparently, about staying. Dad talked her out of the howler, but he couldn't talk her out of wanting everyone home. He leaned on the stone railing and watched the entrance hall below. She wasn't pleased about us staying, but she sent a package this morning, so I think she's forgiven us. What was in it? Didn't open it yet. Hermione says we have to wait until Christmas morning. He paused. I told her that was a Muggle thing, but she said it wasn't. It was just a decent thing, and then she gave me a look. Harry almost smiled. We're waiting until Christmas morning. Obviously, Ron said, and pushed off from the railing. Are you coming to breakfast? The Great Hall's going to be strange. It was. Not unpleasant, just strange, in the way that familiar spaces become strange when they are less populated than expected. The 4 long house tables were still there, the benches still polished, the candles still floating above in their usual arrangement. But perhaps a third of the seats that were usually occupied were empty now, and the sound was different because of it. Conversations did not blur into one another the way they usually did at breakfast. You could hear individual voices, individual words. A boy somewhere down the Gryffindor table was explaining something about his Christmas plans to someone who had apparently asked. Two Ravenclaws across the hall were having a quiet disagreement about something Harry couldn't make out. The Slytherin table was noticeably less populated than usual, more so than the other tables, he thought, though he didn't let himself think too much about why that might be. Hermione was already seated, a book propped open beside her plate, in the way that technically violated a rule she had once told both of them about reading during meals. She looked up when they sat down. "Lavender left this morning," she said. "And Parvati. The dormitory is very quiet." "Is that bad?" Ron asked, reaching for toast. Hermione considered. "No," she said, in the tone of someone who had genuinely thought about it. "It's just different." The food was the same. It was always the same, which was one of the reliable comforts of Hogwarts, that whatever else changed the breakfast things appeared reliably and in the usual quantities. Harry poured himself pumpkin juice and looked down the table. There were perhaps 15 Gryffindors remaining, some of whom he knew well and some of whom he knew only by sight. The Weasley twins were absent. They had gone home too, after a prolonged and apparently entertaining argument with Percy's empty chair, which Ron had described to Harry in some detail. It was the first Christmas in several years that neither Fred nor George would be in the castle, and their absence had a particular quality to it. Not quite a silence, more like a specific frequency of sound that was no longer being produced. Professor McGonagall was at the staff table. She had her usual expression, which could mean anything or nothing, and she was drinking tea with the careful attention she gave to most things. Dumbledore was there too, which Harry noticed because he had not been certain Dumbledore would be. He was at the center of the table, speaking quietly to Professor Flitwick, and his presence had the effect it always had on Harry, which was to make the room feel slightly more ordered, as though the air itself had been persuaded to behave. Harry looked away before Dumbledore could look back. They ate without hurrying. There was no particular reason to hurry. Classes had officially ended 2 days ago, and the remaining students had been given a kind of gentle, unstructured freedom for the holiday period. No timetables, no homework deadlines that could not theoretically be done later. Harry had a potions essay that was supposed to be completed before term resumed, and he had thought about it several times with the particular quality of thought that was mostly a decision not to think about it further. Ron had the same essay and had apparently not thought about it at all, which Harry found both irritating and quietly admirable. "What are we doing today?" Ron asked, around a mouthful of toast. "Nothing," Harry said. Ron nodded, as though this were a plan. Hermione turned a page. By mid-morning, the last of the departing students had gone. Harry knew this, not because he had watched them leave. He hadn't, but because of the quality of the silence that settled over the castle afterward. It was a different silence from the one that had existed while people were still in the process of leaving, which had been a silence with movement in it, with potential, with the sense that at any moment something might change. This was a settled silence. The castle had finished exhaling, and now it simply was what it was: large, stone, cold at the edges, warm at the center, and containing perhaps 60 students and a full complement of staff, where usually there were hundreds. Harry walked. He did this sometimes without particularly meaning to. Set out in one direction and ended up somewhere else, following a route that his feet seemed to have learned independently of his conscious attention. Hogwarts rewarded that kind of movement. There were corridors he had walked hundreds of times that still occasionally produced something he hadn't noticed before. A painting he had never looked at properly. A window at an angle that caught the light differently in winter. A staircase that in the ordinary bustle of term time simply functioned as a staircase, but emptied of traffic revealed something of its own character. The worn quality of the stone steps in the center where centuries of feet had passed. The slight unevenness of the banister. The way sound traveled differently here than 3 corridors over. He ended up on the 5th floor without having decided to go there. A portrait of a witch in a blue traveling cloak was snoring softly in her frame, her painted head tipped to one side, a book open on her lap. A suit of armor near the end of the corridor stood with the particular patience of something that has been standing in the same place for a very long time and has made its peace with this. Outside the window, the sky had shifted slightly, the grey acquiring a faint white undertone that suggested the promised snow might arrive before the day was out. Harry stood at the window for a while. The grounds below were empty and still. The lake was the flat, dark colour it went in winter, barely distinguishable from the sky at the horizon. The Quidditch pitch was visible in the distance, its goalposts rising from the frosted grass, and Harry looked at it for a moment, and then looked away. He had a complicated relationship with the Quidditch pitch this year, which was another thing he was getting better at not thinking about. The castle around him made the sounds it always made, a low, ambient murmur that was not quite wind and not quite stone settling, but something between the two, as though the building were conducting a private and ongoing conversation with itself. In term time, you stopped hearing it because there was always something louder. Now it was present and constant, and Harry found that he didn't mind it. It was a sound that suggested the castle was occupied, inhabited, continuing to function in its own particular way, regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. He found Ron and Hermione in the common room in the early afternoon. Ron had wizard chess set up on the low table near the fire and was playing against himself in a way that appeared to involve the pieces arguing with him about his decisions. Hermione was in the armchair she usually occupied, though she had turned it slightly toward the window in a way that suggested she had been watching the snow that had begun, quietly and without drama, to fall. There were only a few flakes visible through the glass, drifting rather than falling, and the grounds below had acquired a faint white haze that would thicken through the afternoon. "Snow," Harry said. "Obviously," Ron said, without looking up. The knight on the board said something in a small, indignant voice that Harry didn't catch. Harry sat on the hearthrug, which was the warmest place in the room, and also the most defensible if you didn't want to be easily dislodged. The fire was well built. The house elves kept it at a consistent height that suggested some understanding of exactly how warm a room needed to be, rather than a simple instruction to maintain a flame. And the heat from it was even and comfortable. Harry leaned back on his hands and looked at the ceiling. Sirius said in his last letter that he'd try to send something. He said, for no particular reason other than that he had been thinking it. "That's good," Hermione said. She didn't look up from her book. "He can't do much from where he is?" "No." There was a silence. Ron moved a pawn. The pawn expressed reservations. "He said the house was quiet," Harry continued. "His letter, he said Grimmauld Place was very quiet with everyone gone." He paused. "I don't think he minds it. He said that he didn't mind it. But I don't know if—" He stopped. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed that was not uncomfortable. Hermione turned a page. Outside the window, the snow continued, patient and unhurried. "We could send him something," Ron said, still looking at the board. "Mum packed extra shortbread. I could send him some." "He'd like that." "Yeah." The fire shifted, one of the logs settling lower with a quiet sound, and the light in the room changed slightly. Warmer, more amber. Somewhere above them, in the upper dormitories, a floorboard creaked in the way that certain floorboards in old buildings occasionally do. Not because anyone is walking on them, but simply because wood is a material that continues to move and adjust over time, that has a life of its own beneath the surface. Harry looked at the window. The snow was falling more steadily now, the flakes no longer drifting but following a consistent downward path, and the grounds below were definitely white. The forbidden forest at the edge of the grounds was very dark against the snow, its tree line sharp and still. Hogwarts in winter had a particular quality. He had never quite been able to articulate to himself. Something about the way the cold air and the warm interior existed in close proximity, the way you could feel both simultaneously if you sat near enough to a window. It was different from the cold of Privet Drive, which had simply been cold in the way that houses without sufficient heating were cold. Here the cold was something outside, something the castle held at bay without effort, simply by virtue of being what it was. Stone walls of considerable thickness, centuries of accumulated enchantment, fires that burned in every inhabited room. He thought, not for the first time, that whatever happened, whatever the year held, whatever Umbridge put in her next decree, whatever Dumbledore wasn't telling him, the castle itself remained constant, not unchanged. It moved, it shifted, its staircases rearranged themselves, its portraits wandered from frame to frame, but constant in the way that mattered, which was that it continued to function, continued to exist, continued to be a place where the fire was warm and the snow fell outside, and somewhere below in the kitchens, the house elves were already beginning whatever they began at this hour of the afternoon, producing smells of pastry and something warm and spiced that drifted upward through the floors with the reliability of a well-kept promise. "Rematch?" Ron said to the chessboard. The pieces began to reset themselves with the resigned air of pieces that already knew how this was going to go. Hermione turned another page. Outside, the snow continued to fall, quiet and steady, covering the grounds in a layer that was still thin but would not be by morning. Harry stayed where he was on the hearthrug and felt, in the particular way that Hogwarts sometimes made him feel things he hadn't expected to feel, that this was all right. Not perfect, not uncomplicated, but all right. The fire burned, the snow fell, the castle held. The morning arrived without announcing itself. No alarm, no particular sound, just the slow accumulation of light through the dormitory curtains, the kind of light that in winter came late and grey and without urgency, as though it too understood that there was nowhere particular to be. Harry was awake before it had fully arrived, lying on his back in the familiar darkness of the four-poster, listening to the quality of the silence around him and understanding without needing to look that the other beds were empty. Neville had gone home the previous afternoon. Seamus and Dean the morning before that. Ron was in the bed across the room. Harry could hear the particular rhythm of his breathing, but the other three curtains hung still and undisturbed, and the dormitory had the spacious, slightly impersonal feeling of a room that had temporarily forgotten its usual purpose. He lay there for a while, without moving. This was something Hogwarts permitted that Privet Drive never had. The luxury of simply existing in a room, without the immediate pressure of being somewhere or doing something. At Privet Drive, waking early had always carried a faint anxiety, the sense that stillness was a temporary condition that would shortly be interrupted by demands from outside. Here the stillness was self-contained, patient, with no particular agenda. The castle held it without effort. Outside the dormitory window, which faced east and in term time, was useful for checking the weather before Quidditch practice. The sky was the particular white-grey of a morning after snowfall. Not quite cloudy, not quite clear. The light diffused and even. The grounds below would be properly white now. He had watched the snow thickening through the common room window yesterday afternoon, and had gone to sleep, knowing that by morning it would have covered everything. He got up quietly, pulled on his jumper and trousers, and left Ron sleeping. The portrait hole opened onto a corridor that was entirely empty. This was not unusual. It was early, perhaps an hour before breakfast would properly begin. But the emptiness had a different quality than it did in term time. On ordinary mornings, even very early ones, there were traces of recent occupation, a prefect's bag left against a wall, the distant sound of someone in a bathroom, the smell of someone else's breakfast already underway. This morning, the corridor was simply itself, unmodified by evidence of habitation, the torches burning at their overnight level, lower, more amber, producing more shadow than light, and the stone floor cold through the soles of his socks in a way that made him wish he'd remembered his shoes. He walked anyway. The castle was different this way, and he had always known it, but rarely had the opportunity to simply experience it. In term time, Hogwarts was a place you moved through with purpose, with a destination, with the awareness of other people moving around and past and toward you. Without that, it became something else. Not emptier, exactly, but more fully itself, the way a conversation partner becomes more legible when they are not actively speaking. The corridors revealed their proportions. The ceilings, which Harry had spent 5 years walking beneath, turned out to be higher than he usually perceived them to be. The vaulted stone overhead, catching the torchlight and throwing it back in patterns that during term time simply merged into the general ambient brightness of the school. He went up rather than down, for no reason except that up was the direction his feet chose. The staircases, in the absence of the usual traffic, were doing what staircases at Hogwarts did when they were not required to be practically useful. Harry rounded a corner on the third floor and found the staircase he wanted had gone. Not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, but simply redirected, now leading upward at an angle that would take him to the 5th floor rather than the 4th. He stood on the landing and looked at it for a moment. During term, this was mildly inconvenient, something to be navigated quickly with an awareness of the clock. Now it was simply interesting. The staircase moving in the particular way that things at Hogwarts moved, with the casual purposefulness of something that had been doing this for centuries and found no reason to explain itself to anyone. He took the redirected staircase to the 5th floor, which he hadn't particularly intended to visit, but which turned out, on a quiet winter morning, to have its own qualities worth noticing. The 5th floor corridor was longer than the 4th's and wider, and had 3 windows on the north side that in summer would overlook the kitchen gardens, but now overlooked a white expanse punctuated only by the dark shapes of the greenhouses. Professor Sprout had evidently been at work in them recently. There were boot prints in the snow, leading from the castle door to the nearest greenhouse and back, already half filled with overnight snowfall, suggesting she had visited sometime in the previous afternoon. Harry looked at the prints for a moment, following their path with his eyes, and thought that it was somehow characteristic of Professor Sprout that her footprints in the snow pointed toward a greenhouse full of things that needed tending, a portrait he had passed many times without looking at properly occupied most of the wall between the 2nd and 3rd windows. It depicted a landscape, unusual for Hogwarts, where most portraits contained figures, a painted hillside in autumn colours, the trees rendered in the warm ochres and deep reds of late October, a path winding upward through them toward a building just visible at the crest. There were no figures in it, or Harry had always assumed there were no figures. He stopped now and looked properly, and after a moment noticed, just visible in the shadow of the trees at the lower left, a painted figure sitting with his back against a trunk, reading. The figure was small enough that at corridor walking speed, you would simply not see him. He appeared to be deeply absorbed in his book and had no interest in Harry's attention. Harry looked at the painting for perhaps 2 minutes, which was longer than he had ever looked at any painting in the castle that was not speaking to him, and then continued down the corridor. The owlery was his original destination, though he had approached it indirectly. He climbed the final staircase to the tower and emerged into air that was genuinely cold. The owlery was open to the elements in a way that most of the castle was not, the arched openings in the stone walls letting in the winter morning without apology. His breath made shapes in front of him. The floor was deep with straw and the accumulated evidence of many owls over many years, and the smell was particular and familiar, and above him in the rafters, where yesterday there had been perhaps a dozen birds, there were now perhaps 8. Hedwig was on her usual perch. She watched him climb the last few steps with the expression she had, which was not quite patient and not quite impatient, but something in between. The expression of a creature that has long since decided that its person is well-intentioned but chronically difficult to predict. Harry held out his arm and she stepped onto it, and he carried her to one of the arched openings and stood there with her in the cold, looking out over the white grounds. The castle's shadow fell long across the snow at this hour, the sun still low and at a sharp angle, and the shadow had the blue-grey quality that shadows on snow sometimes had, softer than the shadow of stone on stone. The lake was visible from here. He could see the dark break of open water at its center, the rest of its surface filmed with a thin ice that was not yet thick enough to bear weight, catching the winter light in a way that made it look like old pewter. Beyond it, the forbidden forest was dark and still, its canopy holding snow in the upper branches, the interior invisible. Hedwig adjusted her grip on his arm and looked out with him for a moment, as though she were also examining the grounds and finding them informative. And then she turned and looked at him instead, which was more of a commentary than he could quite answer. "I know," he said, which addressed nothing in particular and seemed to satisfy her anyway. She launched herself from his arm without preamble, dipped below the level of the window opening, caught an updraft, and rose in a long, smooth arc toward the tree line. He watched her until she was a white speck against the white sky, and then she was gone. By the time Harry came back down from the owlery, the castle had begun the process of waking itself. It was not a dramatic process. It was more a series of small adjustments, the torches brightening incrementally as though responding to some internal signal, the temperature in the lower corridors lifting by a degree that you felt rather than measured, the sounds from below becoming slightly more present. He heard, from somewhere on the floor beneath him, the sound of something being wheeled along a corridor, a cart, perhaps, or a trolley of some kind, and then a door opening and closing. A portrait he passed on the third floor depicting a portly wizard in Edwardian dress, who was usually asleep at this hour, was awake and watching him with mild interest. "Not going home, then?" the portrait said. "No," Harry said. "Sensible," the portrait said, and appeared to consider the matter concluded. Farther along the same corridor, near the junction that led toward the defense classroom, two house elves were at work with the particular efficiency of house elves, who accomplish things by methods that were difficult to observe directly. A length of deep green garland was being arranged along the top of a doorframe. The holly worked through it with small berries of deepest red catching the torchlight, and the elf positioning, it was making tiny adjustments that were invisible to Harry, but apparently important, tilting her head and considering and tilting it again. The second elf was standing a few feet back, as though providing perspective, and occasionally made a small gesture that seemed to indicate a correction. Neither of them appeared to notice Harry, or if they did not interrupt their work to acknowledge it, which was entirely usual. Harry slowed as he passed, watching the garland take shape against the grey stone. The green and red very vivid, surprisingly vivid, against the colourless winter morning. By the time he reached the junction and turned, the doorframe behind him was finished, and he heard the soft sounds of the cart being moved further along. By Christmas morning, he understood, the castle would be transformed. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic gesture, but through this process. Patient, incremental, performed in the early hours by people who considered spectacle beside the point. Hogwarts dressed itself for Christmas the way it did most things, thoroughly and without any apparent need for acknowledgement. Ron was in the common room when Harry returned, sitting in the same chair he had occupied yesterday afternoon, his hair in the condition it was every morning until approximately 10 o'clock, when it appeared to settle into a different configuration on its own. He was holding a mug of something that steamed and looking at the window with the uncomplicated morning expression of someone who had not yet assembled an opinion about the day. "How's it out there?" he asked. "Cold," Harry said. "A lot of snow." Ron nodded as though this confirmed a theory. "Hermione's already up. She was in here when I came down, and then she went somewhere. Library, probably." He said it without judgment. It was purely informational, a reporting of observable fact. Harry sat on the hearthrug again, which was already the warmest place in the room, and accepted the second mug that appeared on the low table beside him in the way that things at Hogwarts appeared when they were needed, without visible agency. The hot chocolate was the real Hogwarts kind, which was different from the ordinary kind in ways that Harry had never been able to isolate, but that made itself immediately apparent in temperature and texture and the faint smell of something that was almost but not quite cinnamon. "The house elves are doing the decorations," Harry said. "In the corridors. I passed them on the 3rd floor." "They'll have been at it since before dawn," Ron said, with the comfortable authority of someone who had grown up knowing things about house elves. "They do the whole castle in one night if they can, but if it's a big year, they start the day before. Dad says the Great Hall takes the most time. The ceiling enchantments for snow, the 12 trees, all the table decorations. They do that one last." "How do you know that?" Ron looked mildly surprised, as though the question hadn't occurred to him. "Just always have," he said. Harry looked at the window. The snow that had fallen overnight was heaped on the outer sill, the glass faintly frosted at the corners, and through it the grounds were properly white now, undisturbed and clean in the flat winter light. The sky had lightened slightly since his walk, moving from white-grey towards something that might, by afternoon, become actual daylight, though it would be the thin, low-angle daylight of late December that never quite committed to illuminating things fully. Somewhere in the castle below, the house elves were working. In the kitchens, preparations of some kind were already underway. A smell had been rising through the floors since he came back in, something involving bread and warmth, and something more complex beneath that, the particular smell of a kitchen with serious intentions. Outside, Professor Sprout's boot prints in the snow were shallower now, the morning light picking them out as slight shadows in the otherwise even white. Ron finished his tea and set the mug down and looked at the chessboard on the low table, which had been sitting there since yesterday afternoon, and which the pieces appeared to have spent the night rearranging into what they apparently considered optimal starting positions. "Black or white," he said. "You choose," Harry said. Ron chose white, which he always did, and the game began with the comfortable inevitability of things that have been done many times before, and the fire burned at its morning height, and outside the snow held the castle's shadow in that particular blue-grey that winter mornings produced, and the day settled into itself slowly, without hurry, the way days at Hogwarts did when there was nothing required of them. The Great Hall smelled different at Christmas. Harry had noticed it before, but never quite registered it consciously, the way the usual smell of the hall, which was stone and candle smoke and the accumulated ghost of 1,000 meals, shifted in December into something that contained pine resin and something warm and slightly sweet underneath, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the season. The 12 Christmas trees that lined the hall had appeared overnight, which he had expected, but seeing them in person was still something different from expecting them. They were tall, taller than he remembered from previous years, though perhaps that was simply the effect of the reduced number of people in the hall, the trees no longer competing with human scale for presence. Their branches were laden with the particular Hogwarts Christmas decorations, real candles burning with a stillness that suggested enchantment, deep red baubles that caught and held the light, ropes of silver and gold that moved very slightly even in still air. The ceiling above showed a sky that was white with cloud, and very small flakes of enchanted snow drifted from it and vanished before reaching the tables, and the combined effect of the snow and the trees and the candles was that the great hall on the evening of the 24th of December felt less like a room and more like a condition, something you were inside of, rather than simply present in. Harry stood at the entrance for a moment before going in. The tables had been rearranged. This was the thing that made him stop. The 4 house tables were gone, or rather, they were still present but had been moved to the sides of the hall, and in the center, set lengthwise and covered with a cloth that was very white and very smooth, was a single long table with perhaps 30 place settings. Students and teachers were already seated, or in the process of sitting, and the arrangement had produced something that felt unfamiliar in a way that was not unpleasant. The usual geography of the hall dissolved, the careful separations of house and rank replaced by a configuration that was simply a table, and people finding places at it with the mild uncertainty of those who have lost their habitual coordinates. Ron nudged him from behind. "Come on, stop blocking the door." They found seats. Hermione was already there, midway down one side, and they settled on either side of her, and Harry looked down the table and took in the arrangement. Professor Flitwick was at the far end, beside a 7th-year Hufflepuff girl Harry didn't know. Professor Sprout was 3 seats down, her hands around a goblet of something warm, talking quietly with Neville. Neville, who Harry had thought had gone home, but who had apparently not, or had returned, though there hadn't been time to ask. Professor McGonagall was across the table and slightly to the left, in the straight-backed posture she maintained even at Christmas dinner, though she had, and Harry noticed this as a notable fact, a small sprig of holly pinned to her robes, which was not something he had ever seen before. Dumbledore was at the center of the table. He was speaking to no one in particular, and apparently to everyone at once, which was a quality he had without apparently trying, and he was wearing robes of deep midnight blue that had small silver stars on them that moved, and his expression was the one Harry found most difficult to read. Not the twinkling one, not the grave one, but the third one, the quieter one, which suggested that he was simply present and finding the present moment sufficient. Harry looked at his plate. The food came in the usual Hogwarts way, which was to say all at once and without preamble, the dishes appearing on the table with the quiet reliability of things that had been done this way for a long time. It was the full Christmas arrangement: roast goose and roast potatoes and bread sauce and sprouts and something with chestnuts and gravy in a jug that refilled itself at intervals, and the combined smell of it rose into the candlelit air and made the hall feel, for a moment, entirely sealed from everything outside its walls. Ron had the expression he always had in the presence of serious food, which was one of focused appreciation, and he served himself with the efficiency of someone who had learned early that hesitation at a full table was a risk not worth taking. Hermione spooned vegetables onto her plate with the thoughtful care she brought to most things. Harry took what was in front of him without particular strategy and ate without rushing and listened to the table. It was different from ordinary mealtimes. The sounds were different, lower, more varied, individual conversations distinguishable from one another, rather than blurring into the usual hall noise. He could hear Professor Flitwick at the far end saying something about a spell he had been meaning to refine, his voice carrying the particular enthusiasm it had when he was talking about magic he found genuinely interesting. He could hear 2 seats to his right, a Gryffindor third year named Carter, asking Professor Sprout a question about something, and Professor Sprout answering it with the unhurried thoroughness she brought to questions about plants. McGonagall said something to Ron. Harry caught it only partially, something about whether he had written to his mother or intended to. Ron said that he had, or was going to, or both, and McGonagall said something else that was too quiet to catch, and Ron looked briefly and uncharacteristically earnest in the way he sometimes did when talking to adults he genuinely respected but would never admit to genuinely respecting. And then he went back to his goose. "What did she say?" Harry asked. "Just asked about Mum," Ron said, not quite looking at him. "Whether she was all right with us staying." He was quiet for a moment. She remembered her name, Mum's, her first name. He said it without apparent significance, but Harry understood that it was significant. That Professor McGonagall, who had taught perhaps 500 Weasley family members across the decades, and who had plenty of other things to keep track of, had remembered his mother's name and thought to ask about her. Ron ate a roast potato. "It was nice," he said, flatly, which was the most he was going to say about it. Hagrid arrived late. He came in from the side entrance near the staff table end, ducking beneath the doorframe with the automatic economy of someone who had been ducking beneath doorframes his entire life. And he was carrying, Harry squinted, a very large, slightly misshapen pudding on a plate that would have been enormous for an ordinary person and was merely large for Hagrid. He set it at the end of the table with careful hands and then found a seat at the far end, wedging himself onto a bench that had apparently been reinforced for the purpose, and he was wearing a large knitted pullover in a particular shade of orange-red that was very vivid under the candlelight, and he looked, Harry thought, looking down the table at him, genuinely pleased to be there, in the comfortable, uncomplicated way that Hagrid was pleased by things, without any of the complicated layers that pleasure had for most people. "He made it himself," Hermione said quietly. "The pudding. He told me yesterday he'd been working on it for 3 days." "Is it safe?" Ron asked. "He said so." Hermione paused. "Mostly." Harry looked at the pudding. It had the quality of something that had been produced by someone with great enthusiasm and adequate skill, which were not always the same proportion as ideal, but which often produced results that were more interesting than technically perfect things. It listed slightly to one side. He decided he would have some. The meal went on without hurrying. The dishes cleared themselves between courses in the gradual way, rather than all at once, which produced a kind of gentle rhythm. The main things withdrawing, a pause, the puddings arriving, Hagrid's contribution installed at the centre with some ceremony by Hagrid himself, who navigated the length of the table with his plate held above the heads of everyone seated and disturbed nothing except for one goblet that he apologized to with considerable sincerity. Harry ate pudding and looked at the table. It occurred to him in the unfocused way the thoughts occurred at the end of large meals, that this was something he had not expected from this Christmas. He had expected the stay to be all right. He had expected it to be better than Privet Drive, which was a low enough bar that almost anything cleared it. But he had not expected the table, the single table, the holly on McGonagall's robes, Hagrid's listing pudding, Ron's brief and uncharacteristic earnestness. He had not expected the hall to feel like this, which was occupied in a way that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with some other quality that he couldn't name precisely. Dumbledore, from the centre of the table, was laughing quietly at something Professor Flitwick had said, and the laugh was not the one for public occasions, but a smaller, more genuine one, and for a moment he looked like someone who was simply at dinner with people he was glad to be having dinner with. Harry looked away. After the pudding, Hagrid's, which was dense and extremely sweet and had a complexity of flavour that suggested several experimental decisions had been made during its construction, all of them committed to with full confidence. People began to drift rather than leave. A few students peeled away toward the door. Professor Sprout and the Hufflepuff prefect were engaged in what appeared to be a continuing conversation. McGonagall refilled her goblet and did not immediately stand. Ron was talking to Neville, who had appeared beside him at some point during dessert. Harry hadn't spoken to Neville yet this holiday, and listened now with one ear. Neville was saying something about Gran, about how she had wanted him home but understood why he'd stayed, and Ron was listening with the uncomplicated attentiveness he had when the subject was family. Hermione, beside Harry, had produced a small notebook from somewhere and was writing something in it that was probably not notes based on the quality of her attention. More reflective, less purposeful. "What are you writing?" Harry asked. "Nothing important," she said, and then, apparently reconsidering the dismissiveness of this, "Just something I want to remember." He didn't ask what. The candles above the table burned at the particular steady height of enchanted flames, and the snow on the ceiling drifted and vanished, and the trees along the walls held their light, and the hall, which had transformed itself overnight and would transform itself back in due course, held the evening in the patient way it held everything, thoroughly, and without any need for comment. Hagrid was telling someone a story at the some far end of the table. Harry couldn't hear the words, but could hear the rhythm of it, the rise and fall of Hagrid's voice, the pause at the interesting part, the small sounds of the listener's attention. The story appeared to involve something large and probably dangerous, and almost certainly from the forest, and Hagrid was telling it with the relish of someone recounting something he had found more exciting than alarming at the time. Harry finished his pudding. Beside him, Hermione's pen moved quietly across the page. Across the table, the holly on McGonagall's robes caught the candlelight each time she turned her head, a small pulse of red and green, and the evening continued as evenings at Hogwarts did, without urgency, without destination, simply forward into itself, one moment following the next, in the easy procession of a night that had nowhere it needed to arrive. The library was not entirely silent. Hermione had expected it to be, had, in fact, been looking forward to that particular quality of silence, the library's own specific version of it, which was different from the silence of the dormitory or the common room or the empty corridors. The library's silence had texture. It was built from the accumulated presence of books, thousands of them, their pages and bindings contributing something to the air that was almost physical, a density, a stillness that was not the absence of sound so much as the presence of something that sound could not easily penetrate. She had been thinking about it since breakfast, in the way she sometimes thought about the library when she was not in it, as a place with its own climate, its own rules of atmosphere. But it was not entirely silent when she arrived. Madame Pince was at work at the far end, in the section near the restricted stacks, doing something with a trolley of books that involved careful examination of each volume before returning it to its shelf. The sound was very quiet. The soft resistance of a book being withdrawn, a pause, the whisper of pages, the muted return. And it had a rhythm that was almost musical, regular without being mechanical. Hermione stood at the library entrance for a moment listening to it, and then found her usual table and sat down. She had brought nothing to work on. This was deliberate, and it had required a small but genuine act of will. She had stood in the dormitory that morning with her bag open and had looked at the potions essay parchment and the arithmancy reading she had been meaning to finish and the notes she had been compiling on a topic that was not strictly required for any class, but that she had been thinking about anyway, and she had consciously closed the bag without putting any of them in it. She had brought instead only a book she had been meaning to read for herself, not for class, not for research, a collected history of magical legislation in Britain from the 14th to the 17th centuries, which she had taken out 3 weeks ago and not yet opened because there had always been something more immediately necessary. She opened it now. The binding was stiff in the way of books that had not been opened recently, and the smell of it was the particular library smell, familiar and specific, old paper and something beneath that she had never been able to identify and had eventually decided was simply time, the accumulated time of a book that had been sitting on a shelf for a long while, waiting. The pages were dense with text in a small typeface, and the margins were narrow, and the author had the Victorian habit of extended sentences that required you to hold the beginning in your head while the middle developed at length before the end arrived to resolve it. Hermione found this satisfying rather than difficult. It required a particular quality of attention that she associated with reading for herself rather than reading for a purpose, attention that was patient rather than directed. She read. The snow against the window began sometime in the late morning. She became aware of it gradually, not a sudden shift in the light, but a slow accumulation. The grey outside the tall library windows acquiring a white quality, flakes visible at first only when she looked directly, and then increasingly present at the edge of her attention. The library faced north, which meant it received little direct light at the best of times, and in December the light was always cool and indirect, and fell at a low angle through the glass, illuminating the nearest bookshelves in a way that made their spines readable without being warm. The snow made it different, not brighter. The sky behind the snow was still uniformly grey, but softer somehow, as though the light had been filtered through an additional layer of something diffuse. The books nearest the windows caught it differently than they caught ordinary December light, and the effect was that the library felt more interior than usual, more contained. The contrast between outside and inside more pronounced. Hermione read 3 pages without looking up. Then she looked up. The snow was falling in the steady, unhurried way it had been falling all morning, not driven by wind, not falling hard, simply present and consistent, each flake tracing a path from somewhere above the window frame to somewhere below it, patient and without apparent urgency. The grounds beyond were white and still. She could see, at the far edge of her sight line, the beginning of the forest, its dark canopy carrying snow in the upper branches in the quantities that would eventually become too heavy and release all at once in small cascades. She watched the snow for a while. This was another thing she had been allowing herself more of lately, simply looking at things without the simultaneous process of categorizing and analyzing that usually accompanied observation. It had taken practice. Her mind had a tendency, well established over years of academic habit, to move immediately from seeing to understanding, from noticing to noting. But there was a quality of attention that preceded all that, a simpler registering of the thing itself before the interpretation began, and she had been trying to locate it and spend more time in it. The snow fell. She looked at it. That was all. Madame Pince's trolley moved to a new section, the wheels quiet on the library floor. Hermione had been aware of her the whole time in the peripheral way you were aware of someone who was present but not requiring anything of you, a comfortable background awareness, the sense of another person going about their own business in the same space. She turned a page and read about a piece of legislation from 1592 concerning the use of memory charms on Muggle officials, which had been amended 3 times in its first decade, and then quietly repealed, and then quietly reinstated under a different name. And she thought about the way institutions moved through time, accumulating these layers of revision and reconsideration, each amendment a record of someone deciding that the previous version had got something wrong. She was still thinking about this when Madame Pince appeared at the end of her row. She was not, it turned out, doing anything in particular at Hermione's row, just moving the trolley past on her way to another section. But she paused at the end and looked at the title of the book Hermione was reading. And something in her expression shifted, not into warmth exactly, but into a different quality of attention. Holroyd's legislative history, she said. It was not quite a question. Yes, Hermione said. 3rd edition or 4th? Hermione checked the spine. 3rd. The 4th has a corrected index, Madame Pince said. The 3rd's index has an error in the M section. Mnemonic charms are listed under memory, suppressive rather than memory, alterative, if you're using the index. I wasn't using the index, Hermione said. I'm just reading. Madame Pince looked at her for a moment with an expression Hermione could not entirely interpret. Then she said, The 4th edition is on the shelf behind you, 3rd bay from the left. She moved the trolley on. Hermione turned and found the shelf, found the 4th edition. It was slightly thicker than the 3rd, the binding a deeper green, and brought it back to the table and set it beside the other. She opened both to the same chapter and read them side by side for a while, not because she had needed to cross-reference anything, but because the comparison was interesting in itself. The way the same information organized slightly differently produced a slightly different experience of reading it. An hour passed, or perhaps more. The light from the windows shifted in the way winter light shifted, not through any increase in quality, but through a change in angle, the snow outside altering its character from mid-morning falling to something that had the quality of mid-afternoon, heavier, slower, the flakes larger now and landing on the windowsill in visible accumulation. Hermione turned pages. The trolley moved distantly at the other end of the library. Somewhere above her, in the upper gallery that ran around 3 sides of the library and that contained the oldest and least borrowed volumes, there was a periodic sound of something settling, books shifting against each other, or the wood of the shelves adjusting in the cold, or both. She became aware, gradually, that she was hungry. This was later than she usually noticed it. She checked her watch and found that it was past 2 o'clock, which meant she had been reading for nearly 4 hours, which was longer than it had felt. She finished the paragraph she was on. It concerned a commissioner named Aldrich Foss, who had spent 11 years attempting to standardize the definition of a memory charm across 17 regional magical councils and had produced, ultimately, a document of such comprehensive qualification that it satisfied no one and was filed in 17 different places under 17 different headings, and closed both books and sat for a moment in the particular way you sat at the end of a long stretch of reading, feeling the room reassemble itself around you. The library was still. Madame Pince's trolley was no longer audible, which meant she had either finished or moved to a section too distant to hear. The snow against the windows had settled into a steady, patient fall, the kind that suggested it would continue through the afternoon and into the evening without particular drama. Hermione put on her scarf before she stood. She returned the 4th edition to its shelf. 3rd bay from the left, the spine facing correctly outward, level with its neighbours, and kept the 3rd edition for her bag because she had not finished it and intended to continue. She walked to the library door and paused there, the way she sometimes paused at the end of things that had been good, not performing a pause, but simply experiencing the transition. The library behind her was very still. The books were in their places. The light from the northern windows fell across the nearest shelves in the cool, diffuse way it had been falling all afternoon, and the snow was there beyond the glass, accumulating on the outer sill in a drift that had grown visibly since morning. It occurred to her, standing there, that she had spent 4 hours reading a book she had chosen entirely for herself and had not once thought about the essay or the homework or the particular situation regarding Umbridge and the educational decrees and the various anxieties of the year that were always present at some level of her attention. She had not suppressed them. They had simply been absent, the way things sometimes were when something else occupied the space they usually filled. She thought this without particularly resolving it, and then she went out, and the library door closed behind her with the quiet, decisive sound it always made. In the corridor outside, the torches were burning at their afternoon height, and the smell of something from the kitchens had reached this floor, warm and bread adjacent, and distantly, from somewhere below, she could hear voices, more than two, probably students gathering somewhere before dinner. The castle around her was doing what it did, simply continuing, and she went along the corridor toward the stairs with her bag over her shoulder and the book inside it, and thought about Aldrich Foss and his 17 definitions and the 11 years he had spent on something that came to nothing, and whether nothing was quite the right way to describe it. Harry woke to the weight of something at the foot of his bed. He lay still for a moment, disoriented in the particular way of waking in a familiar place that has temporarily become unfamiliar. The dormitory darker than usual, the curtains drawn against the morning, the silence absolute in a way that term-time mornings never were. Then he remembered Christmas, the castle, Ron in the bed across the room, the other 3 beds empty, the grounds outside white and still. He sat up and reached for his glasses. The something at the foot of his bed was a pile of packages, modest in number but present, which was what mattered. He looked at them for a moment in the grey pre-dawn light that came through the gap in his curtains. The shapes of them, the different wrappings, the particular reality of objects that had been placed there while he slept by people who had thought of him. He had never quite got used to this. 5 Christmases at Hogwarts, and he had not got used to it. Across the room, Ron's curtains were still drawn. Harry sat with the packages in his lap and did not immediately open them. Ron was awake by the time the light had changed enough to suggest that morning was properly underway. The grey becoming fractionally less grey, the outlines of things in the dormitory sharpening slightly, the window showing a sky that was white with cloud but light rather than dark. He came out of his curtains with his hair in its morning configuration and looked at Harry's pile and then at the considerably larger pile at the foot of his own bed, and his expression was the one he had on Christmas mornings, which Harry had observed enough times to recognize. Not excitement exactly, more a kind of satisfied confirmation, the expression of someone whose expectations have been met in precisely the way they expected them to be met, which was its own form of pleasure. "Mum," Ron said, identifying the largest package by its wrapping without touching it. "Obviously," Harry said. Ron sat on his bed and pulled the pile toward him and began the process of sorting, which he always did before opening, a brief organizational interlude in which the packages were arranged by some internal taxonomy known only to him. Harry watched this for a moment and then looked down at his own pile. Mrs. Weasley's package was unmistakable, regardless of its wrapping, which was in a deep red paper that was slightly creased at the corners in the way of paper that had been wrapped by someone doing several things at once. He opened it carefully, in the way he always opened her gifts, which was the same way he opened everything she gave him, with a care that had something to do with not wanting to be careless about it, about her. The jumper was deep green this year, not the Slytherin green, but a darker, warmer shade, the green of pine trees rather than dungeons, and the wool was thick and soft in the way all her jumpers were, knitted with the patient skill of someone who had been making them for decades. He held it for a moment before setting it aside. Beside it, in the package, was a substantial quantity of shortbread. She had included more than usual this year, which he suspected had something to do with Sirius, and a small, handwritten note that said only, "Eat properly. Happy Christmas. Love, Molly." The note was on a card with a robin on it. He set it on the bedside table where he would see it. "Green," Ron said, observing the jumper. He held up his own, which was the same shade as always. The maroon that Mrs. Weasley appeared to have decided was Ron's colour years ago and had never reconsidered. She never changes mine. You'd complain if she did. Obviously, Ron said, and pulled it on over his pajamas, which was what he always did with it immediately. The other packages were smaller, fewer. Hermione had given him a book, not a school book, a small collection of essays on the history of magical cartography in Britain that she had clearly chosen with the specific knowledge that he would not have chosen it for himself and might therefore find it interesting without the interference of expectation. There was a card with her handwriting in it, the letters small and even, which said, "Happy Christmas. I hope this is a good holiday, despite everything. H." The despite everything was very Hermione. The acknowledgement that things were complicated, delivered plainly and without dwelling. From Hagrid, there was a box of rock cakes that had been wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, and that had the density of actual rocks, which was consistent. Harry set them on the windowsill where they would keep. There was a package from Sirius. It was small, a flat parcel neatly wrapped in brown paper, addressed in Sirius's handwriting, which was distinctive and slightly angular, the letters of Harry's name, written with the particular pressure of someone who was accustomed to writing and had never quite abandoned the schoolboy flamboyance in his capitals. Harry held it for a moment before opening it. Inside was a photograph. Not a wizarding photograph. It did not move. It was a Muggle photograph, black and white, printed on the slightly glossy paper of old photographs. And it showed 3 people standing outside what appeared to be a building Harry didn't recognize, somewhere with a low stone wall and a sky that was very bright behind them. 2 of the 3 were his parents, his father with his glasses and his hair, grinning at the camera in the way Harry had seen in other photographs, the grin slightly too wide, the way grins were when someone had just said something and was still pleased with themselves for saying it. His mother beside him, not looking at the camera but at James, her expression amused, and also something else, something warmer beneath the amusement. The third person was Sirius. He was standing on his father's other side with his arm around James's shoulders, and he was laughing, not grinning the way James was, but actually laughing. Caught mid-laugh, his head slightly back, the laugh evidently genuine. He was very young. They all were. Harry looked at his father's face and thought, as he always did, and tried not to, about the particular arithmetic of it. How old James Potter had been in this photograph, and how old he had been when he died, and how those 2 numbers related to Harry's own current age. He did not do the arithmetic. He had learned not to do the arithmetic. On the back of the photograph, in Sirius's handwriting, Godric's Hollow, 1979. He'd just told a joke that wasn't as funny as he thought. Don't tell him I said so. Happy Christmas, Harry. Harry looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he set it carefully on the bedside table, leaning it against the wall so it faced the room. He would find something to put it in, a frame of some kind. Later. For now, it was enough that it was there. Ron had finished opening his packages and was eating a piece of shortbread and reading the back of a box of something, some kind of game or puzzle from the twins. which had a set of instructions that appeared to have been written in a deliberately unhelpful order, and the dormitory had settled into the comfortable disorder of a Christmas morning in a shared room, wrapping paper on the floor, ribbons relocated to places they hadn't started, the various objects of various gifts arranged on various surfaces. "What did Sirius send?" Ron asked, not looking up from the instructions. "A photograph," Harry said. Ron looked up briefly. "Good one?" "Yeah," Harry said. "Good one." Ron looked at him for a moment with the expression he sometimes had, the one that acknowledged something without requiring it to be spoken about. And then he looked back at the instructions. "Fred and George," he said, holding up the box, "have apparently invented something that is described as a confusion conundrum, which is either a game or a puzzle or a trick, and the instructions don't distinguish between these possibilities at any point." "Sounds about right," Harry said. "It says here that the objective is to—" Ron squinted. "Discover the objective." He put the box down. "I'm going to eat breakfast first." The great hall on Christmas morning was the warmest Harry had ever felt it. Not in temperature. The temperature was the same as always. The enchanted ceiling showing a bright cold morning sky, the frost visible on the outside of the tall windows. But warm in the way that a room with a fire and people in it and food on the table was warm. The warmth that had nothing to do with measurement. The remaining students were already there when Harry and Ron arrived, and they all had the slightly softened quality of people who had just opened gifts, not excited, past excitement, into the quieter thing that came after. Hermione was in her seat, her jumper, which was a soft blue that Harry had not seen her wear before, not from Mrs. Weasley, something she must have owned. And she had a piece of toast in one hand, and she looked, Harry thought, rested in a way she rarely looked during term. "Photograph," she said, when he sat down and told her about the parcel. "From 1979, he said. "Him and my parents, before everything." Hermione was quiet for a moment. "That's a good thing to have," she said. "Yes," Harry said. He meant it. It was a good thing to have. He thought about the photograph on the bedside table upstairs, his parents young and laughing in the bright sky of a summer that had been entirely unaware of what was coming, and Sirius mid-laugh with his arm around his father's shoulders. And he thought that this was the thing about photographs, that they did not know what they did not know, that they simply were the moment they were, and that this was both the sad thing about them and the thing that made them worth having. He ate toast. Ron was explaining the confusion conundrum to Hermione, who was listening with an expression of increasing skepticism. Across the hall, Neville was talking to Professor Sprout, who appeared to be describing something about a plant with considerable enthusiasm. The enchanted snow on the ceiling drifted and vanished. The candles burned. Harry looked at his plate and felt the quiet of the morning settle around him, the specific quiet of Christmas at Hogwarts, which was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that sound moved through without disturbing. The castle outside the tall windows was white and still, whatever the year held, and it held plenty. He was not unaware of what it held. It was not holding it this morning. This morning was simply this: toast, and the smell of the hall, and Hermione's expression of skepticism, and Ron's explanation becoming increasingly defensive, and somewhere upstairs a photograph of three young people in a summer that had not yet become history. He reached for the marmalade. The objective, Ron was saying firmly, is to discover the objective. It says so in the instructions. It's very clear. That's not clear, Hermione said. That's definitionally circular. It's innovative, Ron said. Harry said nothing and listened and ate his Christmas breakfast. And the morning continued in the easy, unhurried way of mornings that had nowhere they needed to arrive. The common room was theirs by 9 o'clock. Not exclusively. There were other Gryffindors still in the castle, a handful of third and fourth years who appeared occasionally in the doorway and then retreated upstairs with the particular self-sufficiency of younger students who understood that the common room in the evening belonged to whoever had established themselves in it first, but effectively theirs, the three armchairs pulled into their preferred configuration around the fire, the low table between them, bearing the accumulated evidence of the evening. Hermione's book, face down and slightly splayed, in a way that would have bothered her if she had noticed it. Ron's half-eaten bag of Bertie Bott's, Harry's jumper draped over the arm of his chair because the fire had made the room warm enough that the extra layer was unnecessary. The fire was well into its evening height, the logs burning down to the stage where they produced more heat than flame. The light in the room, amber and still. Outside the common room, windows the night was fully dark, had been dark since late afternoon as December nights were, and snow was falling again, visible in the light from the windows as a slow, consistent movement against the black. It was the kind of evening that had no particular shape, which was its own kind of shape. They had not planned to spend it talking. The talking had begun the way it sometimes did between the three of them, not with a decision, but with a gradual accumulation of small things said, one leading to the next, without anyone intending a conversation. Ron had said something about the confusion conundrum, which he had spent part of the afternoon attempting to understand with decreasing confidence in the instructions. Hermione had said something in response about the nature of instructions that were designed to be unhelpful, which had led to a brief and inconclusive discussion of whether Fred and George had done it deliberately or whether it was simply the natural result of two people writing instructions who found the thing they were instructing self-evident. This had led, by a path Harry could not entirely reconstruct, to a conversation about Umbridge. It had not been a long conversation about Umbridge. Ron had said her name first, in the context of something about next term, and for a moment the name had sat in the warm room with an unpleasant quality, the way certain words did when they were brought from one context into another where they didn't belong. Then Hermione had said something measured and sensible about the DA and what they had accomplished in the previous term, and Ron had agreed in the way he agreed with Hermione when he thought she was right, but didn't want to make a significant thing of thinking so. And Harry had said very little, and then, without any particular decision being made, they had stopped talking about it. This was something the three of them had developed over 5 years, the ability to approach a subject and then retreat from it without the retreat feeling like a failure, without anyone needing to formally announce that they were retreating. The conversation had simply moved elsewhere or dissolved into comfortable silence, and the fire had continued to burn, and no one had required the Umbridge conversation to have a conclusion. Harry appreciated this more than he could easily explain. Hermione had her book again, the Holroyd, which she had apparently not finished, and was reading it in the way she read things that were for herself, rather than for class, which was slower and with more pauses, her eyes sometimes stopping on a passage and remaining there for a moment before continuing. Ron was nominally playing chess against himself again, but the pieces had apparently lost confidence in his commitment to the game and were conducting their own proceedings with a degree of autonomy that suggested they no longer felt his input was necessary. Harry watched a rook make a move that was clearly unsanctioned, and Ron's bishop object, and Ron not notice any of it. Harry looked at the fire. He had been thinking about Sirius on and off since the morning, not with the particular anxiety that thoughts of Sirius usually carried during the day, the awareness of the house and the enforced stillness and all the things that were wrong about the situation, but with something quieter. The photograph, the fact of it. Sirius had kept that photograph for over 15 years, through Azkaban and everything after, or had known where it was and had located it and sent it, which was its own kind of keeping. Harry thought about what it meant to hold on to something like that for that length of time and decided he didn't want to think about it too directly, which was all right. Some things were better held sideways. He thought, instead, about the photograph itself, his father's grin, his mother looking at James with that particular expression, serious mid-laugh. The summer of 1979, unaware. He tried to imagine what an ordinary day had been like for them then, what they had talked about, whether they had argued about small things, whether his mother had always looked at his father with that expression, or whether it was one for special occasions. He found he couldn't quite construct it. They remained, in his imagination, slightly flat in the way that people you knew only through photographs remained flat, real but not fully dimensional, existing in a permanent, present tense that was also permanently the past. He looked at the fire and let the thought settle. Ron yawned. It was the yawn of someone who was not yet ready to go to bed, but whose body had begun making arguments in that direction. The yawn of early evening tiredness rather than late-night exhaustion. He stretched in his chair in the way that always involved his elbows going in directions that threatened nearby objects, and the chess pieces paused their autonomous game to observe him with something like resignation. "What time is it?" he asked. Hermione checked her watch without looking up from her book. "Just past 9. Doesn't feel like it." "It never does here," Hermione said, in the tone of someone making an observation rather than a complaint. Harry thought about this. She was right. Time at Hogwarts had its own quality, particularly in the evenings, particularly in the common room, particularly with the fire. The hours moved differently here than they did in the world outside. Not faster or slower exactly, but with a different texture, as though each hour had more interior space than ours usually did, more room for things to occur inside them. He didn't say this. He thought it, and then let it go. Hermione's quill appeared at some point. Harry hadn't noticed her take it out. But there it was, moving across, a piece of parchment she had found somewhere. Small and precise movements, the sound of writing quiet under the sound of the fire. She was not writing notes. The quality of her attention was too private for notes. She wrote for a while without apparent awareness of either of them. And then She stopped and read what she had written and made a small correction and continued. Ron had abandoned the chess game to the pieces, who were now conducting something that appeared to be less a game than a form of highly opinionated debate. And he was looking at the fire with the thoughtful expression he sometimes had when he was thinking something he hadn't decided whether to say. "Do you ever think," he said, not to either of them specifically, "about what it'll be like after?" Harry looked at him. "After what?" "Just after." Ron moved his hand slightly, a vague gesture that encompassed something too large to be specific about. "When it's finished. Whatever happens. What everything goes back to." The fire moved. Harry thought about the question, which was the kind of question Ron occasionally produced unexpectedly, not framed as anything significant, delivered in the same tone he used for observations about Quidditch or food, but containing something real beneath the casualness. "I don't know," Harry said. "No," Ron agreed, easily, as though this were sufficient. Hermione had stopped writing. She was looking at the fire too now, her quill resting against the parchment, and her expression was the one she had when she was thinking something through, rather than when she had already thought it through. More tentative, less certain, the process still visible. "I think about the library," she said quietly. Ron looked at her. "The library?" "Coming back to it when it's ordinary again." She paused. "When I can come in and it's just the library. Not," she stopped, "just the library." Neither Harry nor Ron said anything, and this was correct. The thing she had said was complete in itself, and anything added would have diminished it. The fire shifted, a log settling lower, and the light changed slightly, warmer, more concentrated, and the shadow at the edges of the room deepened. Ron fell asleep before 10. It happened gradually, and then completely, in the way Ron slept. First the quality of his stillness changing, then his breathing, then his head finding the angle it would occupy for the night, tipped slightly toward his shoulder. The chess pieces noticed this before Harry did, and had the grace to conduct the rest of their proceedings in something closer to silence. Harry sat with the sleeping Ron, and the writing Hermione, and the fire, and felt the evening hold them without effort, the common room warm and amber, the snow outside the windows doing what snow did, falling, accumulating, patient. He thought about the year. He could not help thinking about it sometimes, when things were quiet enough that the usual noise of daily urgency was absent. Umbridge and her decrees. The DA in the room of requirement, the spells practiced in deliberate secrecy, the particular atmosphere of a school that had been changed in ways that were difficult to name precisely, but impossible not to feel. Dumbledore's distance, which was real and not imagined, which had a cause he did not know and which he had spent a portion of every week trying not to think about. Sirius in Grimmauld Place, stationary, held still by circumstance, in a way that Harry understood was costing him something significant. And Voldemort, always Voldemort, the name he said in his head because Dumbledore had told him to, and because not saying it felt like a concession he was unwilling to make. Present in the year the way a weather system was present, not always visible, but altering everything regardless. The quality of the air changed by the pressure of his return. He looked at the fire. He was 15 years old, and the fire was warm, and Ron was asleep in the chair beside him, and Hermione was writing something private on parchment in the amber light, and outside the castle, the snow was falling steadily over the white grounds. And all of this was true simultaneously. The year and the common room, the weight of it and the warmth of it. He had learned, or was learning, that these things did not cancel each other out, that the difficulty of the year and the warmth of this room could both be real at the same time, that you did not have to choose between acknowledging one and experiencing the other. This seemed important, though he couldn't have said why exactly. Hermione stopped writing eventually. She read back over what she had written, with the careful attention of someone checking that the thing on the page corresponded to the thing in her head, made one final small adjustment, and then set the quill down and capped the ink and folded the parchment and put it away. The book she placed on the side table, properly this, time closed, a slip of parchment marking her place. She pulled her knees up to her chest and looked at the fire. "He's asleep," she said, about Ron. "He went about half an hour ago," Harry said. She looked at Ron with the expression she had for Ron when he wasn't watching, which was fond in a way she managed differently when he was awake. "He was up early," she said. "Christmas morning." "We all were." "Yes." The fire burned down another degree. The chess pieces had reached some kind of resolution, or at least a cessation of hostilities, and were standing in a configuration that might have been either a final position or an agreed pause. Outside, the snow had thickened again, the flakes visible against the window glass, larger now, the kind that accumulated quickly. Hermione looked at the window for a while. "It was a good day," she said, not brightly, quietly, as a simple statement of fact, the way she stated things she had considered and found to be true. Harry looked at the fire. "Yes," he said. She unfolded herself from the chair and picked up her book and said good night, and her footsteps on the dormitory stairs were quiet and then gone, and Harry sat alone with the sleeping Ron and the dying fire, and the snow fell outside in the dark, and the castle held the night around them, patient and thorough, as it always had. The morning of the 27th came in quietly. Harry was awake before Ron again, which had become the pattern of these holiday days, his body having settled into an earlier rhythm without the structure of classes to organize it around, waking in the grey pre-dawn and lying still for a while before deciding to move. He dressed in the dark dormitory, listening to Ron's breathing and the silence of the empty beds and the particular quality of a castle morning that had no schedule attached to it, and went downstairs. The common room was empty. The fire had been rebuilt overnight. The house elves, their timing reliable as ever, and was burning at its morning height, lower than evening, steadier, producing a heat that had not yet accumulated into warmth, but was working toward it. Harry stood in front of it for a moment, with his hands extended, and then went to the window instead. Outside, the grounds were still white. 3 days of snow had built it up into something substantial, the paths invisible, the flower beds buried entirely, the stone edges of the courtyard walls topped with a rounded layer that had the soft architectural quality of things that have been covered by incremental accumulation rather than a single event. The sky above was clear for the first time since Christmas Eve, a pale winter blue that in summer would have been insignificant, but in December had the quality of an unexpected gift. The light it produced, sharp and clean and angled low across the white grounds, in a way that made everything cast long shadows. Each stone and tree and post rendered in shadow as much as in itself. He stood at the window and looked at it for a long time. The owls began arriving mid-morning. He heard them before he saw them, crossing the grounds from the direction of the owlery, white shapes against the pale blue sky, more of them than there had been in several days, which meant the post had been held somewhere or had accumulated and was now releasing. He was in the entrance hall when the first of them came through the high windows that were opened for owl post, a tawny bird with a small package attached, which it delivered to a Ravenclaw girl crossing the hall below with the directness of an owl that has been carrying something for several days and is tired of it. More followed. Not a flood, a gradual return, 4 or 5 at intervals, each finding its recipient with the competence that owls applied to finding things, and the entrance hall acquired a brief, occasional quality of animation that it had not had for several days. People looking up and extending arms and examining packages with the particular attention of letters received after a gap. Hedwig found him in the corridor of the entrance hall, which she had always been good at. She landed on his shoulder with her usual certainty of welcome and held out her leg, which bore a small roll of parchment secured with a red ribbon. Harry detached it, and she remained on his shoulder while he read, which she did sometimes when she considered the correspondence sufficiently important to wait for a response. Sirius's handwriting. Short this time, shorter than his letters usually were, which were often long in the way that letters from people with time on their hands and a lot to say tended to be. This one was half a page. Harry. Hope Christmas was good at the castle. Molly sent shortbread. Tell Ron he has good taste in family. Things quiet here, which is the required condition, so I'm not complaining. I've been thinking about that summer, the one in the photograph. Your father spent 3 days trying to teach me to cook one specific thing. I won't tell you what. It's embarrassing for both of us. And failed completely, and we ate at the leaky cauldron instead. And your mother said she'd told him it would go that way, and he said she hadn't told him. She'd implied it, and she said that was the same thing. I thought you should know these things. Write when you can. S. Harry read it twice. Then he folded it carefully along its original fold and put it in his pocket and stood in the corridor for a moment with Hedwig on his shoulder, feeling the weight of the letter and the lightness of it simultaneously. The smallness of the story Sirius had told, a failed cooking attempt, and the leaky cauldron and his parents arguing amiably about the difference between telling and implying, and the fact that Sirius had kept it, had remembered it across everything, and had sent it in the particular understanding that Harry needed not the large things, but the small ones, the ordinary texture of lives that had existed before they became the lives they were subsequently known for. Hedwig butted her head against his cheek once, with the restrained affection she deployed on occasions she deemed significant, and then launched herself back toward the owlery. Harry watched her go. He found Ron and Hermione in the great hall at lunch. The hall had changed again, not dramatically, not all at once, but perceptibly. The single long table from Christmas dinner was gone, the 4 house tables restored to their usual positions, and the Christmas decorations, while still present, had a slightly different quality. The candles lower, the garlands on the walls settling into their second week with the comfortable familiarity of things that had been looked at long enough to begin to disappear into the background. 2 of the 12 trees had been quietly removed. The ceiling showed the clear winter sky from outside, the pale blue sharp and cold above the candles. There were more people, not term time numbers, not even close, but more than the past few days. A group of Hufflepuff students Harry didn't know well had returned that morning, and there were 2 Ravenclaws who hadn't been there at Christmas, and across the hall a Slytherin boy was eating alone with the self-contained air of someone who had arrived back early by choice and was comfortable with this. The sounds of the hall had shifted to accommodate them, not louder but more varied, the particular frequency of a room that has more voices in it, even if those voices are mostly quiet. Harry sat beside Ron and across from Hermione, and they ate lunch, which was soup, a thick winter soup with bread on the side, and talked about nothing in particular, which was to say, they talked about the things that had accumulated over the morning in the way that things did, small observations without particular weight. Ron had received a letter from his mother containing a postscript from Ginny that was longer than the letter itself. Hermione had finished the Holroyd in the library that morning and had a particular quality of satisfaction about this that expressed itself as a kind of settled brightness, the look she had at the end of something undertaken for herself and completed. Harry told them about Sirius's letter, not all of it, but the story of the cooking and the leaky cauldron, and Ron laughed briefly and genuinely, and Hermione said it sounded exactly like something his father would do, which it did, which was the good and difficult thing about it. In the afternoon, Harry walked. He had become accustomed to this over the past few days, the afternoon walk that was less a destination and more a way of being in the castle, of occupying its spaces without any requirement attached. He went upstairs rather than down, through corridors he had walked every day for 5 years, and which had, in the relative quiet of the holiday, revealed something of their own character, the particular proportions of this staircase versus that one, the way light moved differently on the north side of the castle versus the south, the small accumulated details of a building that was too large to be known all at once and had to be learned incrementally over time. He passed the portrait of the autumn hillside on the 5th floor. The small painted figure was still there, still sitting with his back against the painted tree, still reading. Harry stopped and looked properly, as he had on the first morning, and after a moment noticed that the book in the figure's hands appeared to be different from the one he had been reading 3 days ago. A different color, a different size. He thought about this for a moment, whether painted figures within landscape paintings changed their books between viewers, and decided it was exactly the kind of thing Hogwarts did without explanation and without any particular need for one. He continued to the window at the end of the corridor. The grounds below were still white, but the snow had a different quality in the afternoon light than it had in the morning. The sharp shadows of dawn replaced by a softer, more even illumination. The white no longer brilliant, but matte and quiet. The lake was visible in the distance, dark at its center, the frosted edges catching the low afternoon sun. Somewhere on the path between the castle and the greenhouses, Professor Sprout's new boot prints tracked through the snow, fresh and clear. He stood at the window for a while. He could hear, distantly from below, the sound of the castle resuming. A door, voices, someone on a staircase. The returning students finding their rooms, unpacking, beginning the slow process of Hogwarts, reassembling itself around the ordinary structure of term. It would be complete in a few days. The corridors full again, the staircases busy, the particular noise of a school in session occupying every space. The quiet of the past few days would close, over, become memory, become one of those periods that could only be described to someone who had been there and would still be difficult to describe. He looked at the grounds one more time. Then he put his hand in his pocket, where Sirius's letter was folded along its crease, and turned from the window and walked back along the corridor toward the stairs, and the castle received him as it always did, without ceremony, without condition, simply open around him as he moved through it. Its stones the same temperature they had always been, its torches burning at their afternoon height, its portraits conducting their own quiet business in their frames. Somewhere below, the soup from lunch would still be warm. He went down,